everyone. We are so happy to have Stephen Dahill back with us by popular demand. He is, for those of you who didn't catch him the first time, I'll give you a quick little bio. He is a descendant of rebels and sea captains. His ancestors span from Irish patriots that were hung in the 1798 Irish uprising, put my glasses on, to a Revolutionary War hero, Commodore John Barry, who was the father of the United States Navy. As a sailor himself, Steve lives between Boston and Marion, where he's always looking at the water. And he's here to talk about his new novel, Clipper Wars, which is actually book 3 of the Age of Sail trilogy. So please welcome Steve Dahill.
Thanks very much, Patty, and thank you all for joining me here on a beautiful day here in mid-October in Cohasset. It's lovely to be down here in the South Shore. As Patty said, I've written 3 novels, the 2 of which are available for sale right here. If we run out here, you can get them at Buttonwood Books in Cohasset, a lovely, lovely bookstore, and they can order more directly from the publisher. The first book in the trilogy is called Privateer, and it's about to be released this fall from my publisher. So it's a little out of order, but the first book I wrote is the second book of the series, which is called The Secrets of Mary Celeste. And I was here earlier this year talking about that book. I'm just curious, how many people were in the audience then? Okay, and how many of you bought the book and read the book? Okay, all right, well, we got a couple more here we have to work on you. Secrets of Mary Celeste was based on a true story. A family from Marion, Massachusetts, back in the 19th century, left on a ship called the Mary Celeste from New York on the way to Portugal, and they never made it. However, the ship was discovered drifting, and to this day, it's considered one of the world's greatest unsolved mysteries. Number 1 on that list would be what happened to Amelia Earhart. Number 2 was who was Jack the Ripper? Number 3 was what happened to the crew of the Mary Celeste? Number 4 is what was or what is the Loch Ness Monster? So it's in good shape, and it's the only top mystery that they have not made a major Hollywood movie starring Brad Pitt and George, what's his name? George Clooney. So if there's any Hollywood producers in the audience here tonight, please see me afterwards and we'll strike a deal. So The Secrets of Mary Celeste I wrote a couple of years ago. It was released in 2023. And as I wrote the book, I said, well, I'm kind of curious what's going to happen to these people, because, there are survivors, unlike the crew of the Mary Celeste. And so I continued writing, and I bumped up the storyline 20 years later to the 1850s, and hence the book, the novel Clipper Wars. Privateer, which will be out this fall, it goes backwards in time to the War of 1812, which in doing my research, I discovered was a war that would have and almost did change American history in a major, major way. And most people in this current, generation of non-historians don't realize how close we were to separating the northeast part of the country from the rest of the country, and how close Britain was in controlling the Mississippi River, fully intended to take the whole western half of the continental United States back into their domain. All of that storyline comes out in the book Privateer. So hopefully that'll pique your interest, and we'll talk about that later. So I'm going to go right into the presentation, and hopefully I'll do this in the right order. Bottom line is all 3 books are about 2 families. So it's a family saga, or a group of family saga, that spans the years from 1812 to 1850, which I've called the Age of Sail, because during this time frame, the technology of developing not only warships in the early part of the 19th century, but merchant ships in the mid part of the 19th century was considered the AI of its stage. I mean, this was really the leading technologies, with the leading industrialists, with the leading nations all leading the charge. And it has a lot of parallels to what's going on in today's world. Before we get into the Age of Sail, however, Years ago, I found the story of the SS Portland to be very relevant to any kind of ship that goes to sea out of the sight of land. It is a very dangerous world out there. Unknowns happen all the time. As a matter of fact, just on a lark, I picked up The Perfect Storm, and I'm reading that for like the third time, the story of the Andrea Gale. And what happens to ships in heavy seas is just fascinating, and particularly the gale of 1898. We've just seen two horrific hurricanes in Florida, and we all know, living here in a town like Cohasset, and I live in Boston Harbor and in Marion, we know how susceptible we all are to the ravages of the sea. In 1898, this might have been the original perfect storm. This was a storm that lasted for, a day and a half. I mean, hurricanes, when they hit, generally it's a matter of a couple of hours, and they're in and they're out. Imagine a storm blowing for 30 hours over 60-foot waves in the ocean, 100-mile-per-hour winds. 150 plus ships sunk during that 30 hours all across New England, and 500 lives were lost, including people on the SS Portland, which left Boston. Well, actually, before we get into the voyage, the SS Portland was a wooden ship. It was almost 300 feet long. It was a side paddle wheeler, which was the original steamship technology before propellers were proven to be an effective way of moving a ship through the water safely. Paddle wheel steamers were all the rage, mostly used in coastal trade, coastal passenger trade, and in-harbor transport. So paddle wheel steamers would be the ones that would be towing a clipper ship, for example, from the shipyard where it was built to the docks where it would provision out into New York Harbor, where it would end up sailing around the Cape Horn. The SS Portland, it was a huge ship, 300 feet long. It had a crew of 63 people, most of whom were African American. On this particular voyage, it only had 129 passengers, but it could take up to 800 passengers. Wow. And interesting, to this day and age, there was never a manifest written of who was on the ship. So when the ship disappeared, people didn't know who was on it, who to notify. Families lost a family member. They had no idea what happened to them. So for 192 people, there was also only 80 life vests. When you see the video, you'll understand why that probably was irrelevant, as was the fact that the lifeboats could not be launched because of what happened. So she left Boston Harbor from India Wharf, where I happen to live, which was the steamship authority headquarters for Boston. And most of the travel, of course, in the 19th century was coast to coast, town to town. There was no interstate highway system. There was no state highway system. There was no automobiles or trucks. So all of the transportation, whether it would be for commercial use or passenger use, was done on steamships such as the SS Portland. Left from India Wharf, but she never made it. Now we're going to go right to a video. And what I ask you to look at on this particular video is how, when the paddle wheels come out of the water, what happens? The ship cannot maintain its forward momentum. And when it hits a lot of water, let's say on one side or the other, it can be driven right into the ocean. So here she is leaving Boston. It was windy, and they knew a storm was coming, but the captain, like all captains, thought he could outrun the storm. He learned that he couldn't. So here the ship is going into the wind, and the wind's increasing. Probably 30 knots here, now 40 knots. Notice the paddle wheel on the starboard side, what happens to it? It cannot grab the water. The ship is foundering. So the captain probably tries to turn around to go with the wind, which would be a safer course, but he doesn't make it. Notice that the cabin top, the infrastructure, all gets completely wiped out immediately. And here, the paddle wheels are driving the ship underwater. It's still moving. The engines are still running. No one had a chance to get off. You can see where you could not have launched a lifeboat in such a sea. And that technology, in 1898, was quickly being surpassed by the Cunard lines out of England. So that's the story of the Portland Gale and the SS Portland. And why is it relevant to the age of sail? Is because most shipwrecks happen near shore. Here is the course of the estimated course of the Portland. So we know she left, where are we here? We know she left India Wharf right here, out through Boston Harbor, around President's Roads, out past Graves Lighthouse, and she was heading to Portland, Maine, approximately this direction. She wouldn't have been too close to Marblehead, Nahant, or Cape Ann. She would have left that well to her port. But at some point, the captain realized he was not making headway. And the only way to save the ship would be to go with the wind, downwind. And this is where she was discovered, 3 miles off the coast of Provincetown. So likely, and we don't know this because there was no radio communication, likely the captain was trying to either A, get back to Boston, but the wind wouldn't have allowed that, or perhaps he was trying to get into Scituate Harbor, which would have been the most likely refuge, or Provincetown. But he never made it. However, in 1889, they found the ship. So it's intact and 400 feet of water, and you can upright, and you can see that the bow is facing south and the stern is facing the north, opposite the direction where it was headed. So that tells the experts, and I'm not a nautical expert, it tells the expert that she was running with the wind in an attempt to save the ship, and the ship was in dire straits at that time. Not unlike what a sailing ship would do. So the Age of Sail presentation is all about Massachusetts. It's all about sailors. It's all about the ships they sailed on and the voyages that they took. And why is this relevant today in this time and age? Is because this was the high point in not only American commerce. America was just exploding as a commercial country, but at the high point of transportation over the ocean. In the 19th century, it was a booming economy. The West was being opened. It was a dangerous time. It was a time when life was exciting, but life was also very short. For 300 years in our country's history, most of us, or our families, or our descendants, our ancestors rather, came here by a ship, and most of them came by sailing ships. So we are a country, and our very DNA is nautical in nature, and we have salt. We all have salt in our blood. Most of the trade was in sailing ships. The clipper ship era, which lasted only a few scant years, was the highlight, was the apex of that age of sail. And Massachusetts was the absolute center of clipper ship build, design, and construction. And the families that own these ships are the families that are still with us today. Very famous names all up and along the coast, including in Cohasset. Scituate, the North River, and Marshfield was one of the leading shipbuilding spots, despite the length of time it took to get a ship out of the river into the ocean. It was a major maritime center. So the Age of Sail, and I won't go through each one of these, but great fortunes were made, fortunes were stolen. Gambling was an incredible part of the age of 1850. Not unlike our own age, where you can't turn on a football game and be inundated with ads for online gambling. In the 1850s, they would gamble on anything that went fast. Horses, dogs, roosters, you name it, they bet. And clipper ships were the highlight of that gambling mania. There were families that fought each other for control over the ships, control over the routes, control over the contents. There was many cases of ships mutinying against their crews and their captains. There were pirates all over the world. And we think of pirates as, as Johnny Depp and Errol Flynn back in the age of the Caribbean pirates. But there were pirates all across the South China Sea that these clipper ships had to fight. And stories of love, passion, and heroics. As you read the histories, the families, the husbands and wives, the entire families that went to sea on these ships, presented to me like what an incredible story this is. And if you baked into all of that the world's greatest race between sailing ships, wouldn't that make a great book? And I thought it would, so I wrote it. And it's called Clipper Wars, and basically it's a story based on a lot of true events of a series of clipper ships, 4 to be exact, that went and raced from New York around Cape Horn, around South America, up along the coast of South America and Central America to California for fame and fortune. And those things really did happen, not in the way I describe it. I kind of was liberal with stealing some ship races that happened in the China ship industry with British clipper ships, but the basic idea was there, and the families and the characters are all fictional, but they're all based on real people. So let's talk about Boston in 1850. When I talk about Boston, you can really extrapolate this to mean any seaport in New England, from Portland, from Castine down to Norfolk. Here's an example of what what the Customs House in downtown Boston looked like when it was built. It was built in 1848, so it was brand new at the time of the clipper ship era. And the ships would come right up, the ships would come right up to the front door of the Customs House. So if any of you are familiar with downtown Boston, Atlantic Avenue, the wharfs that are still there today extended another 200, 300 yards into the city proper. And on these wharfs, they would unload the ships with barrels. Now, as we describe sailing ships, and we'll describe more of this a little bit later, the ships were described as a 500-ton ship or a 1,200-ton ship. Ton was not a measurement of weight. If you think about it, well, how would you weigh a clipper ship that was 300 feet long? You didn't. A ton was spelled T-U-N, and it was another name for a barrel. So when you hear of a ship called a 1,200-ton ship, it's because it could fit 1,200 of these barrels, generally of whale oil or water or rum or some other liquid material that was put upon the ships. The wharfs themselves were many little factories of industry. In these buildings, such as the one on India Wharf, designed by Charles Bulfinch, they had offices for the shipping families, they had auction houses, they had warehouses, they had counting offices, they had drinking clubs for the elite of the day. So you'd go upstairs to one of these fabulous salons and enjoy your cherry bounce, which was a popular drink at the time. And outside of the building, so that building we just looked at is actually right there. And outside, and this is India Wharf, this is Central Wharf, so this is the aquarium today. So the New England Aquarium is right here. And outside of the aquarium would be all these packet ships full of fruit from the Mediterranean and the Caribbean, and they would come into Central Wharf and they would be unloaded, and that was how people got fresh fruit, limes, lemons, that sort of thing, from the the warmer climates. This is a picture of a clipper ship called the Defender, which was named after no other than Daniel Webster. So the famous people of the era, Daniel Webster, Daniel Boone, Davy Crockett, were all names of famous clipper ships. This is Long Wharf, where today you can go and eat at the Chart House, which is still there. It's this building right over here. And in the Chart House, in the Long Wharf, what I found interesting about this picture, again from about 1850, is you could get on a ship from downtown Boston and go to Baltimore. Okay, that's on the water. You can go to Philadelphia, but you could also go to Troy, New York. Imagine going from Boston to Troy, New York, around Cape Cod, around Nantucket, past the Shoals, around Block Island, around Long Island, around Manhattan Island, and up the Hudson River to Troy, New York. That was how people got around in those days. You didn't try to transit the Berkshires and then pass Albany. So a very, very different time. Let's talk about the sailors. I found the sailors of this era were very much a put upon class of people. I don't know how to describe them in today's world, but perhaps like truck drivers. It's a tough job. You're on the road, 6 days on the road, and I'm going to get home tonight, as the old song goes. The sailors were a very hardy lot. Many of them grew up impoverished. If you had a farm in Concord and you had 3 brothers and it was split 4 ways, you had a little half acre of land, and if you couldn't live and eat off that land, then you were impoverished and you'd likely go to sea. You couldn't afford to have a wife and raise a family, so you went to sea. This picture is actually a picture, and I won't mislead you here, of not of sailors, but they're fishermen. You can tell because they all have fish scales all over them. But I thought the hardy nature of the faces, and if you look at them with their pipes and their beards and their expressions, this is a hardy bunch and a tough bunch of people. Any sailor in the age of sail could tie up to 36 knots often one-handed. Why? Because you're hanging on with one hand and you have to tie a line with the other hand. So they learn how to tie knots, and some of the knots are pretty complicated. They would only make between $20 and $30 a month, and many ships would take out of that fee the food and the drink that the sailors would consume on the voyage. So many sailors would cross the ocean and come back owing the company money after spending 2 or 3 months with hard work at sea, and would end up signing immediately back onto the ship with the hopes of coming out ahead on another voyage. So it was really an insidious circle of entrapment, if you want to call it that way. Sir, you have a question?
Why were they called clipper ships?
They were called clipper ships because the original design, which really comes from a French design, was used by the fishermen in the Chesapeake Bay. Baltimore, in particular, decided designing these ships, and we'll get into the ship in a minute, with very, very sharp-ended bows, which allowed great, great speed. And the expression was, there she goes, she's clipping along. So it was really just a term that they used in the 19th century. But a clipper ship was a very specific type of ship, and we'll get into that in a little bit better. As a matter of fact, in my book, I do go into a very lengthy description in the words and the minds of the designers and why they built the ships the way they built it and how they were built, with what material they built them with. I'm not going to go through that right now in the talk because it'll bore you to tears, but it's a very interesting design. The other thing I just wanted to mention here with talking about the sailors, and I have great fun with this one, is the language of the sea. They said that sailors in the 19th century, again, during the age of sail, these are mostly sailors aboard sailing ships, had over 300 words that were used unique to the sailing industry that were foreign to landlubbers. So when you went ashore and you were using sailing terms, people would have no idea what you were talking about. And here's a few of the words that are still in our language. It's amazing every time I'm listening to the radio or the television and some commentator will say something, and I'll say, that's a sailing term, and he or she had no idea where that came from. For example, here's one, posh. How many have heard the expression posh? Well, that's a posh design, okay? Posh came from the English travelers that would go from London to primarily India, or perhaps China, Canton, and they wanted the smoothest sailing possible, so they would choose the port side of the ship, which going to China would be on the land side, going around Africa, and it would be warmer in the sun and it would have less wave action and wind action. Coming home, they wanted the other side of the ship for the same reason. So it was port out, starboard home, thus posh. So that's where posh comes from. How about if you're under the weather? Well, that's where you go below because you're seasick. How about if you're 3 sheets to the wind? Okay, we all know what that is. He's had too much grog. And by the way, they fed grog to the sailors on a regular basis, particularly in the Navy, particularly in the British Navy. Otherwise, they wouldn't do what they were told to do. They were inebriated almost every day. How about if someone has an even keel? Well, it's because the ship, if it's flat on its keel, is going to be going faster than if it's on its side and the keel is at an angle. If something is, you finished it through and through, you've heard that expression, when a cannonball goes in one side of the hull and out the other side. So we've been shot through and through, and we're going down, sir. After a fashion is another term, a cut of his jib. You can probably figure that one out. Someone is high and dry when the ship is out of the water. Someone who knows the ropes. That's an interesting one because on these ships, every nation had the same names for the same ropes in the same exact location. They never deviated. Why? Because most of these ships were international. They would have crews from every country, every language. And even though they couldn't speak to each other, they knew what the foremast halyard meant, or what the clue was on the mizzen staysail. So all the terms were the same on all of the ships. To get underway, and that's not weigh, W-A-Y, it's weigh, it's W-E-I-G-H, which means to weigh the anchor, to raise the anchor. Tow the mark. The cat is out of the bag. That's one of my favorites. You've heard that expression, well, the cat's out of the bag. That was when the sailors lined up to watch someone to be punished, whipped, which was very common in all navies, all ships up into the 1850s. they would see the bag that the cat of nine tails, the whip, was held in, and the sailor would go to the other guy, goes, "Here, the cat's out of the bag," meaning we're about to be punished, or someone's about to be punished. So that's not a good thing. A jack of all trades is a sailor that could do almost anything on the ship, because the jack was what they called a common sailor. And of course, the scuttlebutt is the place on the ship where you could get fresh water. And it was the only place on a naval ship, not a merchant ship, but a naval ship, where one could talk to another sailor in private, because it was a common meeting area. So that's where rumors started. So the rumors started around the scuttlebutt. The scuttlebutt was a barrel of fresh water on deck of a ship. But my favorite, of course, is to turn a blind eye on something. We all know what the expression means. It means you're going to ignore a command. That actually comes from Lord Horatio Nelson, in the Battle of Copenhagen. Lord Nelson had an eye injury. He was partially blind, and he often wore an eye patch. And his commander, an admiral of the fleet, told him to retreat. And he put up the telescope, famously, with many witnesses, so this is historical, to his patched eye and said, "I see no order to retreat, carry on." And they attacked the other fleet and won the battle because of that. So there's the history between turning a blind eye on somebody. Those of you that live in Boston, there's actually a Seaman's house still left in North Square, directly next door to Paul Revere's house. Go check it out sometime when you're there. This is an example of a Seaman's house that they had in the 1850s, and it was a place where a seaman could come off a ship and find a place to eat and drink and sleep. But he had to pay for it. And if he came off the ship impoverished, then he was literally homeless on the street, and the only place that would take him in would be another ship about to take off. So they were, it was a very, very tough life. There were a group of men called crimps that would literally drug a sailor or get him so inebriated that he would sign on without his will or knowledge to another ship, and they would drag him onto the ship, and that's how they would get a sailor. That's where the term Shanghai comes from, because many clipper ship crews were shanghaied, which were dragged onto the ships to go to China. However, the passengers on both clipper ships and packet ships, which were smaller, slower versions of a three-masted sailing ship, had it pretty good. You could go to cross the ocean for, what's that say, $140 for a small cabin, and you'd have some level of privacy for you and your spouse. I don't know how those dresses fit into the small cabin, but apparently they did. And it would take, a couple of weeks to a couple of months to cross the Atlantic, depending on the storms. The elite had quite sumptuous cabins. This is a picture of a clipper ship cabin, and you can notice here where we have a piano, you have oriental rugs, you have a mantelpiece with a clock, you have a chandelier overlooking a hat, beautiful, beautiful mahogany cabinetry and wood. And over here, if you look very carefully, you can see on the couch, if I can see it, you can see it, that is the insignia of the line that owns it, and that's the Blackball line, which was owned by a fellow named William Weld. And you may know of his ancestor, a fellow named William Weld, who used to be our governor. Names like the Saltonstalls, the Cabots, the Lodges, the Welds, the Aspinwalls, they're still with us. They own large insurance companies and banks. State Street Bank is a direct lineage to the clipper ship captains of the 1850s. And on board these ships were crews of officers, some of young, were so young they did not have beards yet. So some of these fellows were 12, 13, 14 years old, and they'd go to sea as a young gentleman during the age of sail. The ships themselves. A clipper ship, uniquely in ship design, was built from the inside out. So they started with the waist of the ship, or the middle of the ship, and then built it forward and built it aft. This is at Donald McKay Shipyard in East Boston on Border Street, which is still there today. The shipyard is still there today. And in the distance, you can see the Mystic River Bridge, now known as the Tobin Bridge. So this is what you're looking at from East Boston. The USS Constitution was built on the north end, right about here. And this was the wood all stacked up of things like live oak. The USS Constitution, the reason it's called Old Ironsides, there's no iron in the side of the Constitution, but it was built with live white Georgia oak, which is impervious to rot and almost indestructible. And when you build a ship like that, and it was double planked with very, very heavy, what they call knees, which were the support of the decks, it could withstand cannonballs from another ship, particularly a smaller ship. And the Constitution had a kind of an interesting history where they tended to fight only ships that were smaller than they were, with weaker armament. So its famous history is somewhat skewed in favor of the historians that like to talk about how great the American Navy was in 1812, when in fact we had about 20 ships and Britain had 800. Yet we decided to declare war on them, which makes no sense, but I do explain it in my book, The Privateer. The other materials that they used was rock maple, which again is impervious to water, rot, and it was used for the keel, and white pine, which was used for the decking, which was cheap and inexpensive. One of the reasons that Boston in the 19th century was a leading shipbuilding area is because we had so much wood available from New Hampshire, in particular with the pine, and Maine for the rest of the woodworking. This is a ship called the Glory of the Seas, launched in, I think, 1853. And right here is the famous Donald Mackay, which we'll talk about in a minute. And if you look up here, there's almost 200 people along this rail. This is a massive piece of construction. This is a huge ship, and it's all copper bottom. The reason they put these copper plates on, you can see they haven't finished right there, copper plates which prevents sea growth. So these ships were built for speed and for bulk. You can see how much tonnage. This is probably a 2,000-ton ship. I may say it up there, I don't remember. The cargo was worth $150,000. The first profit, they could make $30,000. So by the time a ship like the Glory of the Seas made one voyage, it paid for itself. The cargo was owned by the ship owner or the ship builder, excuse me, the shipper, not the shipbuilder, and would make a second fortune. And if they went to China and came back across the Atlantic, they made a third fortune. So one voyage over a year, one ship would make a family fortune that is still in existence today. So it was an incredible time of growth. Donald Mackay built most of the famous clipper ships in Boston, but he was not the only one. There were 6 or 7 shipyards in Boston in the 1850s. He built 46 clipper ships over about a 10-year period. So that's 2 every 60 days. So, one a month, he's building these massive, massive ships. And he was a household name in 1850. He literally was the Elon Musk without the political connections of the 19th century. And very interestingly, his greatest design was the largest clipper ship ever built, called the Great Republic. When it was loading its provisions in New York Harbor for its maiden voyage, it sunk to the waterline and it was on fire. And he lost his fortune and died bankrupt. So one of the richest, most famous men in the world did something that no other shipbuilder ever did before his time, which was he owned his own ship that he built. So he built the ship, he paid for it, he provisioned it, he sent it to sea, he lost it. So that never happened again. This ship, the Champion of the Seas, this is a very unique picture of a brand new clipper ship. So it's a photograph of the ship. Right out of the stocks. Here she is. She's actually sitting at Sergeant's Wharf in the north end of Boston. One day she went 465 nautical miles, which was an average of 20 miles an hour, 24/7. So if you can imagine a ship that's almost 2,500 tons, so think of 2,500 of those barrels down below, was doing 20 knots all night, all day for days on end. The mast itself was 200 feet from the deck. So if you fell off one of those masts, you didn't survive. Massive clipper ships and 20-story highs. So I live in a 40-story building, and if you look down 20 stories, you think there was a guy standing there leaning back and forth. I mean, it's just an amazing thing. The Flying Cloud, of course, is the most famous clipper ship probably built in Boston, and it went from New York to San Francisco in 89 days. To give you an example, so 3 months around Cape Horn. Normally it was 6 to 10 months. To take a wagon across from even St. Louis to California would take 6 months to a year. So to do it in 3 months was like going to the moon in an hour. I mean, it really broke all concepts of how transportation could be. And during the California Gold Rush, Boston had a major role because the Ames Plow Company from Stoughton, Massachusetts, after the Ames Hotel on State Street was named after, made all the shovels for the California Gold Rush, and all the pickaxes and all the tents and all of the pikes to go gold rushing and farming. So Massachusetts gear was loaded on these clipper ships, brought to New York. Other provisions were loaded, and they went around Cape Horn. What was unique about the clipper ships built in Boston is they were huge. As you saw earlier with the Glory of the Seas, they were much bigger than any ship from any country, any place. They were massive. Therefore, they could handle the seas. Therefore, they could go 24/7 for months at a time. Therefore, they could afford to have not one but two complete sets of crew so that 30 men could be on call, on watch all the time to manage all of those sails. So here's another picture of, this is, I'm not sure if this is Flying Cloud or not, but another great expression, between the devil and the deep blue sea. That's when you're on the side of the ship, and if you fall, I mean, you're gone. There's no, you don't recuperate from that. And if you notice, I put this picture, look at the three guys up there trying to pull what could be an ice-encrusted sail with bare hands in to reef the sail. Because if these sails up here don't get reefed and the wind is coming up, they're going to lose the mast. And if they lose the top mast, they could lose the rest of the ship. That's how ships sank in those days. But men weren't the only ones that went to sea. There were very many examples of women that would join their husbands on board the ship. This one particular woman, they called her the Florence Nightingale of the sea, took over from her husband who fell sick and died, and she navigated the ship around Cape Horn and into California. I have this exact story in my book because I thought it was so fascinating, because women, as opposed to most of the other sailors on the ship, were much better read than the men were. And the ones that got tutoring had mathematical skills and could therefore navigate. And of course the captain had the only one with the instruments, a chronometer or a sextant that was used in navigation in those days. And very often, besides the first, second, or third mate, the wife might be the only one on the ship that really could get the ship safely to port. That's just a close-up. That's a photograph that I took of the Stad Amsterdam, which is a modern clipper ship. It comes to Boston every few years. And if you can just look, every one of those lines has a name. A very specific name. Not two of them are the same. Here we have a sailor reefing a jib on the bow, but can you imagine one slip? I mean, look at those. Look at the waves. Look at the ocean. That ship would be a mile away before anyone on the ship knew that one of those guys was overboard. So a man goes overboard on a ship like this, in a sea like that, he's gone. They don't come back for him. That's why sailors never wear life jackets. Think about it. They know they're going to die. They don't want to be bobbing in the water for an hour or two. Flying Cloud, again, is an example of a very fast ship, particularly downwind. When you're going with the wind, which is what the Portland was trying to do, you can make incredible speed, and it's a beautiful, beautiful thing for the people on the ship, for anyone seeing the ship. And that's why so many paintings of the 19th century have pictures of fully rigged clipper ships going at maximum speed. It was a beautiful ship, and it was a very romantic but short-lived era. Why? It was not economically viable. Why? Because the ships didn't last very long. Because they were on, it was sort of like today, if you watch the Deadliest Catch, I mean, those ships are at sea all the time, but they're made of metal. They have machinists on board and equipment. They are rebuilding the ships as they're fishing. You couldn't do that to a wooden clipper ship. But it was a very fanciful era. This is an example of an advertising from India Wharf. Go to San Francisco on the Nightingale. And of course, the Nightingale, the name of the ship, was named after Jenny Lind, who was the famous singer of the mid-19th century. And you can see how romantic an image they're portraying. Here we have a gold miner finding gold. You've got a ship in a beautiful little harbor. I think there's even a native person there in the picture, and here we have a nice friendly bear. So it was a very romantic time. They tried to encourage people to go, but it was a very dangerous voyage to get from Boston to San Francisco. Many ships did not make it. As a matter of fact, in the time between 1850 or 1900, I think, or 50 years, there were 500 or more ships came aground in Wellfleet and Truro. So when you walk along the beaches on the Outer Cape, you can definitely some days find the remains of clipper ships that come through the sand. And every couple of years you read about another one that was discovered. This particular ship was called the Living Age, which I think is ironic for a ship that sank. It took them, I'm going to read this here just so I get it right. It took them 30 days at Cape Horn. That's like going to the dentist office for a month. I mean, that was an awful, enduring voyage. And when they got to the South China Sea, they hit a reef. You can see where it's calm right here. That's because there's no water. And the deep water is over here where the other ship is, and this is a reef breaking on the outskirts. So she hit a reef, the crew got off, and they spent 35 days in an open boat before they were rescued. So it was a very, very dangerous occupation to be a sailor on a clipper ship, and not the least of which is you had to disguise the ship to pretend you were a military ship. So you can see they had painted fake portholes, gun ports, so that a pirate might think incorrectly that they were an armed merchant ship. Here's a fanciful picture of the Mary Celeste, which is the subject of my debut novel, which, by the way, is an award-winning novel. It's just received an award as the best fiction from the Imaginarium Convention out in the Midwest. So it's an award-winning novel about the Mary Celeste, where a ship called the Dei Gracia came across her drifting with her sails in tatters, and the ship was just sailing by herself. And again, that was uncommon to find a ship sailing with nobody on it. Generally, there'd be a reason. They either died of disease, there was evidence of murder from a pirate or a crewman, there was evidence of a shipwreck where the masts were gone. But the Mary Celeste, there was nothing wrong with the ship, except there was 10 people gone, missing completely, and nothing written, nothing in the logbooks to indicate a problem. The Mary Celeste probably looked more like this ship. Here was a ship that came in from the ocean, it came to Hull in the Antarctic, and almost went aground because the sailors could not handle the ropes and the sails. Their hands were totally frostbite, frozen stiff, and at the last moment, the captain threw out the anchor, the ship grabbed the water, and the wind died right off of Nantasket Beach. And as a result, they sent a telegraph, which was a pre-electronic device, from the ship up there to Hull, which was transferred to the Central Wharf in downtown Boston, telling the pilots that there was a ship in need of a tow. And they went out there and they towed the ship into Boston. The voyages, I'll go through this rather quickly, but this is, again, a big part of privateer. And what would happen is, starting in Boston, they would bring all sorts of raw materials over to mostly the British Isles, but sometimes to the Mediterranean. And the biggest transportation would be things like lumber, would be furs, beaver pelts, and then distilled liquors. So rum, in Newport, Rhode Island, in the 1790s, there were 400 rum distilleries in Newport, made from the molasses brought from the South Seas, from the West Islands. So they would bring material over to England and Scotland and Ireland, and for cash, bring the cash down to Africa, buy slaves, bring the slaves over something called the Middle Passage to the West Indies or to Charleston. Okay, sell the slaves to the plantation owners, pick up the proceeds from these plantations, which was generally sugarcane or molasses, and bring that back to New England to make rum and start it all over again. That was called the triangular trade. So one ship, one voyage, 3 profits, incredible profits, and people who got insanely rich doing this triangular trade. And of course, they didn't talk about what happened down here. And the ships had to be fast, so they were often, ships like clipper ships, but they were smaller. They were brigs and schooners that were used to transport the enslaved peoples quickly so that they didn't die. Not for their comfort, trust me. In the clipper ship era, the big route was 17,000 nonstop miles from New York, around Brazil, through the Drake Passage, and Antarctica is right about here, so it's a very narrow passage, up along the coast into San Francisco. Now, some ships hugged the coast, both here and here, getting the winds off of the warm continents. Other ships took a wide route almost to Africa to hit a straight line past the doldrums to get to Cape Horn. Still, other ships, including in my book, took a route right to the Hawaiian Islands. Why did they go to Hawaii? Because from here to here was a very strong North Pacific current. And they could ride both the westerly trade winds coming from west to east, the winds that hit us, and they could have the current going in their favor. And that's what Clipper Wars describes in great details, is how these ships competed against each other, how they got around Cape Horn, and how they got to San Francisco. So Cape Horn was just is and was a horrific place for those that have family members that have been there and know it. What's interesting about Cape Horn, it's the only place on Earth where the ocean winds are uninterrupted all the way around the globe. Every other part of the ocean hits land someplace. That's why the winds that hit Ireland and England are much stronger than the winds that hit Scandinavia or the Netherlands or France or Germany. It's because they're buffered by those islands. In the Drake's Passage, there is no buffering. The winds are nonstop. They can be as high as a 4 to 5 story building on a regular basis. That's not even a storm. So imagine 45 feet high waves. Waves as long as this room is long, 4 times the height of the ceiling. The waves in a storm could be so big that a clipper ship, remember with a 180-foot mast, would be becalmed when they went into the trough of a wave. Because at the bottom of the waves were higher than the masts. And they'd come up the wave and the wind would hit them. And they would take it and do it all over again. It was a phenomenal place. They called it the Roaring 40s or the Screaming 60s. And believe it or not, people to this day still sail around it, without a gun to their head. So I don't know why they do that, but they do. They believe that approximately 10,000 sailors have died trying to round Cape Horn in ships. In 1849, 750 ships left the east coast of America for San Francisco, and many of them did not make it. Why? Because the rush for gold was so prevalent that they would take off in ships that were not meant for the ocean crossings. But clipper ships, and this is where Donald Mackay was the innovator, the ships that he built could handle these seas. And what would take other ships a month going back and forth, tacking and driving to get around the storms, a clipper ship could go straight into it with a small set of sail, power their way through it, and get quickly into the Pacific Ocean. So the most famous race of all time was a true race that I copied the idea behind for Clipper Wars. Left China, 2 ships from England on the same tide. They left Canton and arrived in London 55 minutes apart from each other. When these 2 ships, the Ariel and the Taiping, came up the English Channel, they said there were tens of thousands of people on every cliff and every coast. By the way, I always tell people to turn off their phone before they come to the meeting, but we won't do that. It was the Super Bowl of the 1860s when the English tea clippers would race each other home. And in this particular situation, I think I kind of cut through it. They're doing 14 knots through the ocean, extraordinarily fast. The first tea of the season was a great boon to the captain and to the owners of the ship. So there was an incredible financial incentive to be the fastest ship there. But because they arrived at the same tide, one ship beat the other because they picked up their pilot quicker and was able to get them to the dock at the east end of London. And the 2 captains went below and conspired to share the prize and split it between the two captains. That's why it's a British race, not an American race. That would never happen in San Francisco with any of my boats. Privateer is my third book, starting the series, all about the War of 1812 and the privateers that made a huge difference in the American ability to fight Britain in those days. It's an untold story of both heroism and disasters. That my hero of Privateer is a young woman who inherits her father's business of ships and ship owning, in which she doesn't know until he becomes ill and is incapacitated, that some of his ships are not only privateers, but they're slave traders. So she has got a moral dilemma. Does she continue the slave trade or not? And in those days, the slave trade made the difference during wartime between surviving as an industry, as a business or not. So she had, trying to keep a family going and deciding whether she was going to be a slave trader or not. And that's what Privateer is all about. And I hope that A, you have enjoyed the talk. B, come buy a book. C, if you don't buy it today, go to Buttonwood Books down here in Cohasset and give them my kind regards, and buy other books there too. It's a wonderful, wonderful store. And I'd be happy to answer any questions you might have. Thank you.